So welcome everyone to the 2018 AWS Public Sector Summit. We are pretty excited to have you guys join us and to be back here in DC for our summit. And we hope that you guys spend the next 2 days learning a lot about not just AWS and our capabilities, but specifically how we are helping our public sector customers and partners execute and deliver against their mission, and also help address their business objectives. So as Jennifer mentioned, my name is Keith Brooks. I am head of business development for our AWS GovCloud US region, soon to be regions. And in that form, me and my team are generally responsible for strategy of GovCloud, go-to-market. We are laser focused on ensuring that we have the right services and features and capabilities in the GovCloud region to help our customers and partners. But more importantly, we're laser focused on helping our customers and partners use GovCloud to successfully execute their missions and support their business initiatives. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about software in GovCloud, and specifically software as a service in GovCloud. And the reason we picked this topic is, actually there were a number of reasons, but one of the foundational drivers is that for the last 18 to 24 months, me and my team, and Dave Crewley, my colleague who'll speak here shortly, and his team, we spent a tremendous amount of time talking with software companies and end customers about SaaS, and specifically SaaS and GovCloud. But beyond that, we've also recognized that the general trend for a lot of organizations looking at SaaS actually derives from higher level trends that we see with public cloud adoption, right? And I won't spend too much time on the chart itself, but there's an interesting stat that's on this chart, which has data from the Cisco Global Cloud Index that says by 2020, 74% of all public cloud workloads will be SaaS-based. And that's pretty interesting when you think about that, right? And as it pertains to public sector customers, we also recognize that there's an increasing appetite by government agencies and their solutions providers to also look at SaaS-based solutions, SaaS-based software products to help support their missions and their business objectives. There's an interesting quote that Tony Scott made. So Tony Scott is the former U.S. federal CIO, where he said the U.S. federal government spends more than $6 billion on software. And we also recognize that while that stat is pretty interesting, we recognize that our public sector customers face some of the same challenges that many organizations in private industry face, particularly around software, right? So a lot of our customers have an interesting mix of software, both on premises and some running in the cloud today, right? It's traditionally a mix of on-premises custom-built solutions, right? In the government world, a lot of those are referred to as GOTS, right? So purpose-built solutions that are built by government agencies. We have customers that are using an interesting mix of free and open source software products. We have customers using third-party COT solutions, right? So software products from many of the software vendors that are probably in the audience here. And as we talk to a lot of our CIO and CTO customers, they also tell us that many times, because of those different categories of software, sometimes they don't even know what's running in their data centers or even in the cloud, right? So across open source, third-party products, GOT software, and hidden IT, right, they're really struggling to get their hands around what those products are, really understanding their software licensing, the EULAs that come along with a lot of these software products, and it really hampers their ability to execute software portfolio rationalization, right? So how do we rack and stack, or how do those organizations and customers rack and stack the software products they make and use that as input to drive how they modernize their portfolios moving forward? And what we've heard increasingly for a lot of our public sector customers as well is they're looking at SaaS as a way not to just support rationalization, but to help drive those modernization efforts, right? So they want to get out of the business of installing on-premises software or manually installing software, even on the cloud. And they are looking for software providers and solutions providers to offer those products and capabilities as a service. And as that pertains to AWS, we really have 3 different deployment patterns that we see with customers that are deploying and using software on AWS, and this applies to GovCloud as well. There's the traditional pattern of, a customer buys a software product, they take that software product and using a number of different installation tools and packages, they physically install that software product either on a physical server or a virtual server. In AWS, it's the equivalent of executing those same processes, but you're installing the software on an EC2 compute image. The second method is using something that we pioneered when we first launched AWS, which is called an Amazon Machine Image, or what many people refer to as an AMI or an AMI. And an AMI is effectively a prepackaged template of software that has the software components, any middleware, and the operating system that that software will run on that's purpose-built to easily and in an automated fashion deploy on an Amazon EC2 compute instance, right? So we take a lot of the heavy lifting and manual configuration out of deploying and operating software so that customers can literally, within a number of clicks in the AWS Management Console, deploy a software product on AWS. But as I mentioned today, we're going to specifically focus on SaaS, or software as a service, which, for those of you that are not familiar with SaaS, is effectively a licensing and distribution model whereby a software company offers a software product or a solution to a customer. That solution is hosted and runs on AWS, and in this case in GovCloud, and a customer consumes that product over the internet. And it typically comes with a distribution model and a licensing model that is all wrapped around a pay-as-you-go consumption-based approach. But as you think about SaaS, right, you really got to think about the implications to the customers. And in public sector, there are some interesting requirements and nuances that will affect not only how you build software as a service products in the cloud, but as it pertains to our customers that typically use GovCloud, you really got to think about some of their more nuanced requirements as well, because those things will have impacts to your products, right? So you have to think about things like the operational constructs that your customers have, right? Are there certain operational models or security policies that influence not only how they use SaaS, but if they can use SaaS? You have to think about things like procurement and acquisition, right? How do public sector customers actually get their hands on your software product, right? You got to think about things like distribution and tenancy, and if you need to segment your customer bases to allow them to consume your product in a way that fits their organizational policies and usage models for the cloud. But one of the more important aspects that we increasingly talk to customers about is compliance, right? Which is fundamentally why we built AWS GovCloud US, right? Which is our purpose-built AWS region that's isolated, that's intended for public sector organizations or organizations in highly regulated industries that have a higher bar to meet in terms of compliance, right? Sensitive data, sensitive workloads, highly regulated data, typically in the federal space that aligns to some of the compliance frameworks that I'll talk to here in a second, but a region that allows those customers to run those workloads in the cloud in a highly compliant manner, right? So for software as a service companies, you really got to think about that as well, because those compliance requirements will have implications to how you build, architect, and bring to market a product for GovCloud. But the benefits of GovCloud for SaaS companies is the simple fact that you take advantage of some of the same features and benefits that our end customers take advantage of with GovCloud. Isolated, purpose-built set of infrastructure and services that allow you to run those capabilities in a highly compliant manner. In addition to that, it's built for sensitive data to include controlled and classified information. So many of our public sector customers are actually running one of 16 categories of CUI in GovCloud today. So for a software as a service company, if you want to sell to customers or public sector organizations or highly regulated organizations that also process some of that same sensitive data, you got to think about that from a compliance standpoint to really understand the implications to your product. Mission and business critical workloads. So when you take those first two aspects, what we also see is that a lot of public sector organizations are increasingly using GovCloud for highly mission critical workloads. And there's a number of those that you can reference on some of our public website properties. But the ability to host that sensitive data to address the higher bar in terms of compliance gives public sector customers the reassurance and the comfort that they can use AWS and AWS GovCloud US to address those workloads that tie directly to their mission or to their critical business needs. And then finally, for software companies and ISVs, right, giving you the tools and the resources that accelerate your time to compliance. Because we understand that, like our end customers, we have to meet those requirements for them, and that our broader ecosystem of ISV partners and SaaS partners also have to meet that. So we spend a lot of time, and we've made a lot of investments into building tooling and building resources that help you guys accelerate your ability to address those compliance requirements and to deploy those solutions in the cloud. And from a compliance perspective, we have resources that address a number of compliance regimes and security policies and regulations. But specifically for GovCloud, it really boils down to these 8, right? A lot of our customers are running workloads that are import-export controlled, specifically ITAR regulated workloads. We have a lot of our customers, particularly in the public sector and the federal space, that are running FedRAMP high compliant workloads in the cloud as well, which allows them to address FISMA high requirements. For defense organizations and defense contractors and aerospace companies, they oftentimes also have to address the DoD Security Requirements Guide, security cloud policies. And specifically with GovCloud, right, we give them the ability to address levels 2, 4, and 5 in the cloud. For organizations that deal with sensitive law enforcement or justice and public safety information that have to deal with CJIS, we offer CJIS compliant infrastructure as well. Same thing applies for HIPAA. Same thing applies for IRS 1075, NIST, FIPS, et cetera. So as a software as a service company that wants to sell to these customers that have these requirements, right, the tooling and the resources and the infrastructure that we give you allow you to address these requirements in a way that gets your product in the hands of your customers and allows them to use that product to support their mission. But there's some things that SaaS companies really have to think about, right, even beyond that. You really got to think about your customers. You really have to know your customers, and specifically what their operational policies are and what their security policies are, because those things influence your product. Those things also serve as input into your architecture. And oftentimes, your architecture will drive your product strategy, right? So when you codify those customers and really understand those customers and their policies and their operational constructs, and you use that as input to your architecture, what you typically get is a set of direction that you can follow that really allows you to roll out your product strategy in a way that aligns with your customers' needs and their missions. I can't underscore enough how important compliance is. The first 2 items here typically dovetail straight into compliance. And with SaaS, you really got to think about that, right? Because without compliance, a customer literally cannot use your solution. So we underscore compliance as well as one of the key drivers that a lot of SaaS companies have to think about as they're bringing products to market and designing products for customers that we serve in GovCloud. And then assess tenancy, pricing, and distribution. This is one of those areas where serving public sector customers gets a bit interesting, right? Because you have to think about things like tenancy. If you build a multi-tenant SaaS solution, how do you get that product in the hands of organizations like some of the federal civilian agencies and their usage patterns, and understanding if they use software as a service different from an organization like the Department of Defense? And if you're selling to the Department of Defense, do you need to segment DoD workloads and DoD customers from federal civilian customers, right? And it actually goes a step deeper than that. Within an organization like DoD, right, they could say, well, we need a single tenant SaaS solution just for DoD, or an organization like the Department of Navy or the Department of Army could say, we need a single tenant solution just for our organization. So really understanding what your customers require and desire from a usage perspective will help you rationalize some of those decisions that influence how you bring those products to market. And then depending on how you address tenancy, you may decide to price those offerings differently, right? So if you have to think about things like connectivity, which my colleague Dave Crewley will talk about here in a second, right? Factoring in all those different inputs to drive things like pricing as well, specifically if you have customers that require different tenancy models to consume your product. Adjacent segments. If you're building solutions for the Department of Defense, it's highly probable and highly likely that you will also be able to take those same solutions and sell to the defense industrial base or aerospace and defense companies that have some of those same requirements, whether it's DFARS or DoD SRG or ITAR. So we implore SaaS companies, specifically building in GovCloud, to really think about that, so that you can ensure that you're covering the broadest customer segment and the broadest set of industries for your solutions, right? If you're building for federal government, right, there's a high chance that state and local government customers will require some of those same solutions. Leverage the AWS Partner and Competency Programs. We are here to help you as SaaS providers, and many of you are partners for AWS, right? Not only get the solutions out in the market, but to help you go to market with your customers, right? Our customers come to us and inquire about which SaaS capabilities run on AWS and which SaaS capabilities are in the region. And a lot of our partner programs can help you connect those dots to those customers to get your products in the hands of those customers quicker. And then finally, get the message out, right? Our customers want to know which SaaS products run in GovCloud, which SaaS products are on AWS, which SaaS products address the specific categories that align to the capabilities in their IT strategies and modernization initiatives. So as you bring products to market, don't underscore the importance of, or don't underestimate the importance of the marketing aspect, right? Make it easy for customers in the public sector to describe and discover what you have, right? Because they're oftentimes coming to us, and we want to liberate your solutions so that customers know that there is a wide ecosystem of SaaS products in the market, specifically built for GovCloud and for our customers that require those type of capabilities. So that's some of the why, right? What about the how? I know many of you here are probably highly interested in the how, and specifically, how did you get started technically with building and bringing solutions to market, specifically in AWS GovCloud? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, David Crewley, who's the AWS Solutions Architecture Manager for the AWS GovCloud US region. Dave.
Thanks, Keith. You guys hear me okay? Okay, so thanks, Keith. So we're going to shift gears here a little bit. We heard a little bit about how software as a service works, what are the considerations you need to make for bringing it to market, that sort of thing. Now I'm going to try and dive into some of the technical considerations that you would have to take into account when you're actually building and deploying your solution to deliver it to your customers on GovCloud. So one of the conversations we've had many times with customers is they say, okay, I want to build this solution on AWS. I'm interested in cloud. I want to do this. So you guys have built this infrastructure out, and you've got this GovCloud thing, and it's got an accreditation at FedRAMP ATO, DoD SRG. It's got all these different compliance accreditations already. So if I just build on top of that, I'm good to go, right? And though it makes me sad to say it, I usually have to say, well, nope, it's not quite that easy, right? It's not just build on top of what we give you and you're done. And in fact, what you find is that within our platform, you actually have a high degree of visibility and control over your assets that you deploy in the cloud. So with that control comes the responsibility to lock them down, secure them, harden them to meet the compliance requirements that you have. So that kind of feeds into our AWS's shared security or shared responsibility model for doing security and compliance. So if you want to think of it conceptually, if you want to kind of take the break line for a virtual server, for example, at the hypervisor layer, Amazon owns from the hypervisor down. So we do the hypervisor, we do the host operating system, we do the physical hosts, the network, the data centers, fences and guards around said data center. So we take care of all that. So we're taking care of compliance of the cloud. But once you launch a virtual server, you say, hey, it's going to be a Windows server, a Red Hat Linux server, or what have you. Once you do that, Amazon doesn't really have any visibility into that machine that you're running. So the responsibilities for hardening the operating system, patching the operating system, doing encryption, that sort of thing, are actually your responsibility because you are the only one who can see into that machine. You have control and responsibility for the care and feeding of it. So take, for example, encryption as a requirement. So if you have a requirement for encryption at rest, which, if you're doing something at a FedRAMP ATO or DoD SRG level 4, you probably have that requirement. So in S3, our simple storage service, if you're using that to store your data, we provide you mechanisms by which you can encrypt the data, but it's really up to you to enable them or not. So you can do, for example, client-side encryption. So you can encrypt the data before you ever even send it to us, and then you decrypt it when you pull it back. Or if you want to enable server-side encryption, you can decide, hey, I'd like to let Amazon manage the encryption keys for server-side encryption, or hey, I'd like to manage my own in, we have a key management service where you can manage your own keys for your server-side encryption. So depending on what your needs are, we give you the options and the flexibility to do it, but ultimately the responsibility is up to you to enable what is necessary to meet the compliance requirements you have, which then leads to the obvious question, what are those requirements? So, the different compliance standards that Keith put up on the screen here a few minutes ago, depending on what you're doing and who your customers are, you may need to comply with some or all of these, and depending on which market segment you're after, you may be interested in some subset of these. So you're going to want to actually look at who your customer is, what they care about, and make sure that you're building for the right compliance. So some of these standards on the screen here, like ITAR and CGIS, are kind of region things. The region is accredited to be ITAR compliant or CGIS compliant. Other ones like FedRAMP or DoD Security Requirements Guide, those ones are service by service, which is something else. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but you actually then have to actually look at which services are compliant. So that's kind of one of the first things you're going to do is what compliance requirements am I actually after before you worry about the technical details of what I need to do. So once you've got that, you decide you're coming into GovCloud, you know what your compliance requirements are. Let's talk about some of the architectural considerations you have. So one of the things is you're going to want to decide is what's your starting point. So oftentimes this is not your first rodeo, right? You're not deciding, most of our customers are not deciding to bring a brand new offering to market in GovCloud, and this is the first time they've ever thought about building it. So they usually have some sort of a starting point you're working from. So that could be another AWS region. So oftentimes we meet customers, Keith and I do, where they've actually got a footprint in US East or US West 1 in Oregon, and they're working with commercial customers or maybe some government customers, and now they've met some additional customers who say, I really like what you have, but you're not meeting my compliance bar, so I need you to move into GovCloud. So you need to establish a second footprint. Or you may be we also work with customers who, hey, I've been doing it on premise, it's been working fine, but as I scale up, I find that, you know what, the cloud's a better place for me, so I'm gonna actually move from on-premise out. So how do where are you starting from, what assets do you have? So then that leads you to a conversation around how do I get my stuff out? How do I get my stuff out to GovCloud? And actually we have a session after lunch that we're gonna talk all about how to set up the networking and migration into GovCloud, so right here after lunch, so if you wanna get into the details of that. Then there's the idea of architecture portability. If you're moving from US East, for example, you probably have something that is fairly tuned to the cloud already, so a lift and shift might make a lot of sense. But if you're coming from on-premise, you may have built everything in such a way that if you lift it into GovCloud, it'll work fine, but you might not be getting the best bang for your buck out of cloud, right? So you might want to rethink your architecture a little bit to make use of Amazon's cloud native services. So you might want to have us manage your databases, for example, and use our relational database service, or you might want to use our NoSQL database like DynamoDB, or do serverless computing with Lambda. So you may want to incorporate those things into your architecture when you bring it over. So you might want to do some optimization on the way. And then finally is to think about, well, okay, so we're talking a lot about compliance here, and you may already have a compliance foundation that you're working from. So if you're working in East, you may have already done it, like if you've already done a FedRAMP moderate, if you've already been through a FedRAMP moderate ATO, then you got a pretty good starting place, right? So FedRAMP high is gonna be more controls, but everything you have is applicable, so you can bring all that stuff forward. Or if you have, like, if you've done HIPAA, SOC, ISO, one of those, if you've done audits on one of those, they may be applicable too. So depending on what you've already done from a compliance standpoint, you can bring a lot of that stuff forward and use it as your starting point to accelerate your compliance efforts. Okay, so, and as I talked about the idea of thinking about your architecture and what you might want to do for cloud optimization, one of the things that you're going to want to pay attention to is taking an inventory of the services that you're using and you want to make sure two things. First is that all the services you want are in GovCloud. Our goal for the GovCloud region is to get what we would call pragmatic parity. So we want to get all the services into the region that make sense to be in the region. There are some services we have that the customer base doesn't necessarily have a lot of demand for, so we'll kind of prioritize those lower. But we're trying to accelerate the movement of services into the region, and that's been happening quite aggressively over the last year or so. But there is still a gap where every service that you need may not be in the region. So you're going to want to take inventory of what you have, especially if you've been building in one of our standard regions like US East. You may be using a service that's not in GovCloud. The one that we find frequently trips people up is Route 53. If you need to do public DNS, you can do that in GovCloud just the same as you can in US East. But if you want private hosted zones with Route 53, that's not a service that's available in GovCloud. It's on a roadmap, but it's not there yet. So in the short haul, we've had customers have to make other decisions about how they want to deal with that architecturally, run their own DNS or that sort of thing. So you're going to want to pay very close attention to what the service availability is, make sure you have everything you need. And then the other thing you're going to want to look at is the service, actually for the services that you want, what the compliance posture of those services is. As I mentioned, the compliance accreditations like FedRAMP and DoD SRG are both service by service. So oftentimes people make the mistake of thinking all the services that are in GovCloud have been through FedRAMP High. And that's not, we have a plan to run them all through, but in a practical matter, to actually do a FedRAMP audit, you actually have to have the service running in region first, and typically they like to have it running there for a couple of months so that when we document the controls, they can actually see evidence of the controls actually functioning against a working system. So typically there is a delay between when a service actually gets launched in region, and that can be 3 to 6 months or even longer, because there's only so many things we can run through the FedRAMP funnel at one time. So we try to prioritize based on customer demand which ones we run through first, but there can be a delay there as to how long it takes us to get a new service launched and then get it run through all the compliance wickets that we need. So you're going to want to pay attention to that as well. And in the resources section at the end of my presentation, my section of the presentation here, I actually have links to our public website where we actually have this information available for you, so it's really easy to find. And so you're going to just want to keep that in your back pocket as something to look at as you go forward. Okay. And then the next kind of architectural consideration that we run into a lot with customers is, where's your system boundary? So, in an ideal world, you would deploy your solution in GovCloud, all of your assets would be in GovCloud, and you would manage it in GovCloud, and that would be the end of the story, right? And that would be really simple from a compliance standpoint. Your boundary is inside the region is ITAR compliant, the accreditations on all services apply to the region, and you're good to go. But that's, from a practical standpoint, that's not always the case for our customers. So we run into a lot of folks who, they've got a footprint in another region already, they've got it all stood up, they have their management and their monitoring infrastructure there. They want to extend their footprint into GovCloud, but they don't really want to rebuild all that management and monitoring stack. So they're like, hey, can I deploy all the customer data is going to live inside the GovCloud region, but I'm going to have these little components that are on the outside, or I may have to call out to a service that's not in region. So I might be, bouncing against some other service that is not in GovCloud or actually isn't even in AWS, so I might have to call out to another service. Is that possible? And the answer is yes, that is possible, and we see people do that. However, it does raise your compliance bar a little bit there, the work that you have to do. You have to be really crisp and clear in your documentation of your package when you're going through FedRAMP or SRG about, what's the nature of this communication, how are you encrypting the data, how are you protecting the data, who has access to it, from where, when do they have access, so you're going to have to be very clear about that so that the auditors can make a proper assessment of the risk. FedRAMP is all about risk assessment and risk acceptance. So you need to very clearly document why you're extending the boundary out, for what purposes, and what data is flowing out there, and where your access is coming from. So you have a little bit more work to do there. And then there's also the idea of what data is allowed to flow outside the region. So if you have to comply with something like ITAR, for example, within our GovCloud user guide, which also I have in the resources section at the end of my section, it actually walks through service by service. Here's the data that's considered sensitive and where you should not put it. Here's where you should not put sensitive data if you're using each one of these services to comply with ITAR. So you're going to want to pay attention to that, and even just the encryption of the encryption that you're using to get in and out of the region if data is flowing out of the region. For example, for ITAR, if oftentimes when we connect back to a customer's data center, They put a direct connect line in place, they get a private line, and they say, okay, that's good, right? Well, from an ITAR perspective, that's not good enough, because the data actually flows through one of our co-location facilities, partner facilities, and those are not covered by our ITAR boundary. So the data has to be encrypted, so you end up having to run a VPN tunnel too. So that does actually affect you architecturally, so you need to pay attention to that. Okay. And then that leads also into the discussion of, well, where are my users? And this is going to vary from customer to customer. This is one thing you're really going to have to understand from a customer standpoint. Where are the end users for this system? So sometimes they may be on the internet. They may be coming in from the internet. Other times, for a lot of federal agencies, oftentimes they will actually force the users to actually VPN into the agency network first, authenticate there, and then come across the line, come across a direct connect line to the cloud. So if that's the case, then if you're standing up your application to have public-facing internet addresses and web servers, that's not really going to work very well, because they're not going to allow access directly from the internet. Sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. It depends on the customer a little bit, depends on the sensitivity of the data. So you do need to understand that, because it actually can affect your architecture as to how they're going to let their end users actually access the system. And as part of that, how end users access the system, there's two acronyms that tend to come up that if you've never seen these before and you're actually building a solution that deals with federal government customers, you probably will run into these two, TIC and CAP. If you've never seen them before, they are both network edge protection solutions. So TIC is Trusted Internet Connection. That's what the civilian government uses. And CAP is the Department of Defense's Cloud Access Point. They work very similarly in concept. There are differences between the two. But in the spirit of what they're trying to accomplish is they're trying to limit the number of ingress and egress points to the customer's network. And they're trying to actually analyze traffic that's coming and going. So they do things like packet capture, they look for malicious traffic, they do DNS black holing, that sort of thing. So there's a whole set of requirements for TIC and CAP. And if you have to comply with these, they do impact your architecture, because they affect, as I said, they tend to sit on the edge of the customer's network, and they will actually, depending on the type of system you're deploying, they may force you to come through one of these, which will affect your architecture. And it affects your architecture in one of two ways. There's kind of two models that we see. One model for extending into the cloud for a customer is to treat us as an extension of their internal network. So they say, okay, I'm just going to give a piece of my IP address space to Amazon, to the environment we set up in Amazon. We're going to allow traffic to flow from our internal network to the cloud, and I'm going to set up a secure connection between there. So I'm going to set up a direct connect and/or a VPN. So all traffic going to and from Amazon has to go across this line, and so as part of that, again, if you're set up for public-facing traffic, that could be a problem, right? So that's So all the customers' traffic is going back and forth between here, like customer traffic is going to flow this way. It's going to go from here down to here and back. So anything out in here that needs to go out to the internet is going to have to get backhauled through this connection, through the customer network, out through the trusted internet connection. And these are either, the TIC is actually typically provided by either the agency can provide it themselves, it's called a TIC CAP, or you can have managed trusted internet providers. Those services, those are AT&T, CenturyLink, Verizon. They can actually provide this TIC service on behalf of the customer. In the DoD, the CAPs are run by DISA, and there's a whole other set of rules there. But the kind of the architecture is very similar. So what happens is traffic has to come here, has to go through the TIC, and then out to the internet. And this architecturally can be a challenge at times, because even things that have to get out into the Amazon public address space have to get backhauled through this connection. So for example, if you want to call the public API endpoints for Amazon services, it's got to actually traverse this link and go out. So sometimes customers will allow you to put an internet gateway here, depending on again on the sensitivity of the data and the traffic you're going to allow, so that you can have an internet gateway here just to get out for the Amazon public endpoints. That's the only traffic they whitelist out. But again, that's a conversation you want to have with the customer early, because you don't want to get way down the road and find out, oh, I have to change because now I can't do that anymore. So that is one architecture that we see. The other one is very similar, but this is where the customer actually treats Amazon and any cloud provider as basically an untrusted island. Any traffic that's coming to or from the cloud goes through the TIC period, full stop. So they want to actually do packet capture, filtering, malicious payload detection on every packet that's going back and forth between the cloud and the customer environment. Now, this is obviously a less efficient architecture because it actually forces all the traffic to go back and forth. It can be very expensive for the customer too, but from your system perspective, it doesn't really change your approach much. Whether the customer goes one way or the other, it doesn't matter. But you just have to take that into account if you actually have to comply with a TIC requirement as part of your build out for the customer. Okay, so that's kind of the basics on all the technical things you need to think through. A couple of resources I have here that I talked about. Here are the two websites that I said you want to keep these in your back pocket right here. This is the service compliance, so this actually tells you which services are covered by DoD SRG level 2, 4, 5, which ones are covered by FedRAMP moderate, which ones are covered by FedRAMP high, and in which regions. So this is a good one to have. And then this is services by region. This is the other one that's really key. This one will tell you which services are available in which region. So if you want to know, hey, is this service available in GovCloud? Very easy to check that here. And then the other one that's up here is the GovCloud Users Guide. This one is, as I said, this guide here actually goes through service by service and lists, here are the services that are in the region. Here's how they are different. If there are differences between the way they are implemented in GovCloud versus our standard regions, they will talk about that. And they will also then talk about where you can and cannot put sensitive data if you're complying with ITAR. And then these two on the bottom here, these are two different, to kind of help you with your architectural guidance. These are best practice implementations for dealing with FedRAMP, DoD SRG kind of requirements. This quick start in particular, as I talked about earlier, we handle from the hypervisor down, and then you're responsible for everything above that. But so that gives you a lot of ground to cover. But with these quick starts, we actually give you Amazon best practices for how to set things up, like your access management, your networking, how to structure your virtual private cloud environment, that sort of thing, so that you can then use those techniques in your architecture, and then that will give you the ability to move up the stack a lot higher in terms of the amount of controls that you can cover out of the box before you have to. The only ones you're going to have to worry about are the ones for your actual application. So this one can be very helpful, and it actually has the matrix of here's the controls that are covered, here's how we did it, here's the implementation, and it's got CloudFormation scripts to actually spin it up. So it's pretty handy. And the last one here is another white paper that just talks about best practices for architecture if you actually have to comply with FedRAMP and DoD SRG. So that's all I have. So now I'm going to hand things off to Dave Packer from Druva, and he's actually going to talk. Druva, was actually one of the first software as a service providers to get an authority to operate in GovCloud. So he's going to talk a little bit about their journey and what they did and how they actually went about getting their ATO to deliver software as a service in GovCloud. So, go Dave.
Great. Good, mic's on and everything. Yeah, so as David just said, we went under the FedRAMP process to achieve our ATO last November, and it was quite the journey as a SaaS vendor, especially one of the first. We were kind of a guinea pig through the model of the process. It's interesting, let me tell you a little bit just about Druva, who we are, just so you have some context. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but kind of give you an idea if you haven't heard of us. We're an organization that, let me get to the slide here, there it goes. We have over 4,000 customers today. We're fairly well implemented in the Fortune 500. About 17% of the Fortune 500 uses our product today. We have over 100 petabytes under management today. We're one of the top storage partners inside of AWS. And we span globally across AWS regions, including GovCloud. And really as a business, our focus has been to solve the challenge that most organizations face today around data recoverability, resiliency, the protecting of that information, ensuring that that not only can organizations get it back, but there's ways for disaster recovery and elements regardless of the data source, whether that's across endpoints, SaaS applications, other SaaS services, right, like Office 365, Google, Salesforce, et cetera, and as well as dealing with data center server workloads. And for the more kind of, I would say, modern systems that are implementing, your businesses that potentially are implementing natively on top of AWS, how do you also orchestrate the snapshot management and kind of global footprint of the data that you might be operating inside the cloud itself? The interesting thing for us is that, we look at it and, as a company, we were founded under this kind of philosophy of the cloud had just kind of really started gaining some traction. We built our original cloud product in 2013 is when we originally released it. And our focus was, how do you aggregate all this information together? How do you provide businesses a way to kind of achieve this resiliency but not have to deal with multiple software stacks, right? So, 5 or 6 different applications, people might be using Veritas or Tivoli or, you can go through the list of different vendors out there today. And that only vendor landscape has gotten more complicated. But really, what we looked at was, how do we aggregate this information and then provide the tools for recoverability, for data governance, right? Understanding your data, understanding who has it, where it is, what you're doing with it. Which led us down this route. Actually, the data governance part led us down this route of interacting more and more with highly regulated businesses, right? So a lot of large pharmaceutical companies work with us, a lot of agencies, a lot of government contractors work with us. Because the idea and the concepts around managing data for whether that's for legal purposes or for compliance purposes became very critical to our business model, and that continues to be an area that we get a lot of value from, and a lot of agencies and organizations engage us from. The data intelligence piece is something that's kind of a new area of focus for us as a business, which is how do we help businesses understand that data better? Our largest customer actually today stores around 12 petabytes of data. We have multiple companies that store over a petabyte themselves. And so, having the ability to understand what data is there is really important. Now, what's interesting is we do this in a zero-knowledge architecture, right? So that means that our company itself, we actually don't have any visibility to that data, no understanding what's there. It's all being operated in a fashion utilizing advanced encryption models to actually allow organizations to have this flexibility using the cloud, but without our involvement in the process. And so that's kind of really our value that we bring to the table for these organizations. And we have 3 distinct sets of services, and Sync is what we're most well known for, which is really around end user data, managing it through the various processes, whether that's endpoints, desktops, laptops, mobile devices, or SaaS services, and being able to help organizations there, or Phoenix, which is focused on data centers, and how do you enable an organization to replicate to the cloud, be able to have recoverability, disaster recovery services in the cloud, right? Failover, et cetera. And then Cloud Ranger, which is new to us. We actually just acquired this company, Cloud Ranger, about 2 weeks ago we announced it, which is native AWS services. And so the concept is, how do you give a company the ability to manage this under a single control plane, right? And so that's as a SaaS service, that's what we've been delivering for a while now, is going along this path and helping companies do this. But one of the things that comes up often for us now that we have engaged with a lot of regulated organizations is compliance. Right now, David talked about the shared security model. As a SaaS vendor, just because AWS is FedRAMP doesn't mean we inherit that, right? Yes, the infrastructure is FedRAMP, and that helps us. But the fact is we have to go through the process ourselves, right? That's true for HIPAA, right? If you want to go through the auditing of that, SOC 2, all of those different things, we are a layer on top of the hardware and operations and processes that Amazon manages, but we still need to be able to achieve those same things to be able to provide that to our customers, right? And so that's it's an interesting challenge because when SaaS first, got onto, AWS, and, there was a lot of folks out there claiming, hey, we're certified when you're really not, right? It's just the infrastructure. The SaaS provider still has a huge responsibility because we're handling the data. We can make that secure or insecure based on a lot of parameters. But what we had is we had a lot of organizations that started pushing us in this direction saying, we need to be on GovCloud, right? That was the first, right? There's always an inch turns into a foot, right? So we started with, moving to GovCloud and supporting that region. And, at first it was a little bit challenging because a lot of the services that we had built on, we had to understand kind of where those discrepancies are and where we might run into some challenges. When you look at the footprint, we had already been on the kind of the standard, regions, and we had built a cloud native, right? Which means that we were treating AWS as an operating system rather than just as a hypervisor, right? So these interconnections between EBS and S3 and RDS and DynamoDB were all critical to our business model and what we had built to be able to achieve what we needed to handle all this data. But we also realized that there was a huge business opportunity here. As a SaaS vendor, we looked at GovCloud as not only were we getting the requests from our customers, and we're a very customer-centric organization and want to adapt as much as we can to customer needs, but we also thought that, there's an area here that's being underserved, right? The Cloud First initiative of the government. What vendors were out there that actually support cloud, especially in what we do? And the answer is actually there weren't any. And we had multiple conversations with agencies who wanted to move to the cloud, but they weren't able to figure out how to do it because nobody was really supporting that technology stack for them. And so, we started seeing this market momentum. We got a lot of inquiries, and, being that we had a stack that we can move easily into GovCloud, as David mentioned, it was basically a lift and shift for us. We made that and we thought, hey, we were a pretty natural fit. We have the security models in place already. We're already dealing with regulated data. What more is there to do? So I, myself, naively, jumped into the FedRAMP model, right? And so, this is an interesting element, that came up multiple times, the inquiries around FedRAMP. We have customers, I'll talk about that in a moment today, that needed us to go this direction, right? And, it was interesting because we started the process back in 2014. I tell people it's like a lot of how startups form, right? A lot of startups form because you have two fairly naive people thinking that they have a great idea, so they go out and try to figure out how to build it. And then along the way, they realize they didn't know what they didn't know, and boy, this is a lot more work than we thought. But you've already set down the path, so you're committed, right? And so we were committed, and so we kept down the path on it. But it did take a little bit of time. It took us 3.5 years. But through that process, we learned a lot about our business. We were able to align a lot of our technology and processes, and I would say that the operational processes side of it was probably the biggest part of our business and shifting it. And when you think about it, we learned a lot of things from it. One thing was that our company has, like a lot of software companies, we have a large presence in India, right? We have 300 engineers there. And because of how we modeled our business, it was very important for us to keep engineering next to our cloud operations, right? And that way we were, as patches happen, as changes were happening, all that change management can happen, within that particular area. Well, FedRAMP, obviously, and being on GovCloud, doesn't allow us to have cloud operations in India. So we had to figure out, okay, now that we were doing this differently, we had to train and hire a new staff, right? We had to build that in. The FIPS part, from a product architectural standpoint, probably the biggest thing for us was FIPS. We hadn't had FIPS originally. We were, obviously using AES 256 encryption modules. And when we went through FIPS, it wasn't so hard from an engineering standpoint about implementing it. It was really figuring out all the plumbing and communications between the VPC and email and everything else that we had to figure out how we do what we're doing it today. There were some challenges we faced with DNS that we had to overcome. There was also some things that we learned along the way that were interesting, like, for example, and this was something that, it was just in a customer advisory board meeting yesterday, is, the services that you need to leverage, you have to understand what your architecture is and what those services are that you're operating within AWS. And then you have to understand if they are FedRAMP ATO'd yet themselves, each individual service, right? So, it's not a one mass thing and you've got everything. It's individual services. And so one thing that we ran into was the KMS in GovCloud was not yet FedRAMP ATO'd. And so that created a little bit of a ripple for us because we had to figure out, okay, well, we're on a timeline. We want to get through the process. And so we started an engineering path to figure out how to work around the KMS challenge. But ultimately, I would say that, AWS has been very helpful in giving us guidance and giving us, other experiences. And especially for us, because we were kind of a guinea pig as one of the first SaaS vendors, to give us an understanding of kind of what elements were needed to achieve the outcome we were searching. And then, fortunately, KMS became FedRAMP ATO'd, and then we were able to get on board with that and apply that to our own product. The other thing is, FedRAMP for us, the process of documentation, while there were changes in the FedRAMP process, was also created us a bit of a challenge. We originally were going to go under the CSP model. We looked at the JAB path, but ultimately we needed to work with a sponsor who actually is here today, which is Jeff Schilling in the back of the room, who's part of NCI, the National Cancer Institute, right? So if you're a SaaS vendor, going in the sponsorship route is actually a better process because it allows you to work closely with the customer and understand kind of the nuances of each particular organization and their security profile and what they need to achieve at the end of the day. So our next steps is to move more of our services natively into really the FIPS component being the primary one. Just a side note, FIPS, the big challenge with FIPS for us was that since we already had customers in the region, to turn FIPS on meant we had to basically figure out a model for decryption and re-encryption of all the customer data, right? Which actually took a period of time to work with customers to figure out how and then make that transition. And so that took some time and planning for us as a company. Architecturally, as I mentioned, there weren't a lot of big changes. The main one was the KMS piece for the authenticator. There were some elements around, again, DNS, email communication and notifications and how we handled that. Initial customer spin up and creation. Obviously, we had to notify a customer that their account was ready and that their credentials were ready. And so we had to figure out a slightly different model than the traditional model we worked in the commercial side for that. So that was an important element. So with the last minute or two I have here, just talk about some customer examples. So Port of New Orleans is a great example. They have a fairly large server farm. Their challenge was really around where they're located, where their servers are, and moving to cloud to ensure data resiliency in case of catastrophe, right? So you think about hurricanes, other things that might compromise the port. That was a concern of theirs. And so being able to move that data off-site and be able to take advantage of all the elements that GovCloud has to offer and the ability to provide DR for their VMs. So they can now basically fail over, spin up a VM in the cloud, and be operational again, regardless of the status of their data center. We also, protect, move on to the next one here because I know I'm running low on time. So National Institutes of Health is another example. They, as I mentioned, Jeff Schilling's in the back of the room. They were our sponsor. So if you're interested from a standpoint of a sponsor's point of view and what they went under, he's available if you want to chat with him as well. But they were dealing with researchers in a highly distributed environment of end users, right? So clinical researchers that have a lot of intellectual property that needs to be secured. There's a lot of elements around that from a compliance perspective. And so not only was GovCloud key, but also having the FedRAMP compliance was also very important to them, which we completely embraced and understood and went through the process with them. I give Jeff a lot of props for walking us through the process and engaging with us from the standpoint of a sponsor, because it does take time. There's a lot of things to figure out. And as I mentioned, as FedRAMP was kind of changing some of their processes and elements, it took time for us to understand how to bring that all together. So at that point, I know I'm out of time, and so we ran a little bit over. I will end there and I guess open it up for questions, right? I'll let you up.
Thank you, everyone. If you have questions for the speakers, we're going to hang out in the back for just a few minutes. The next session is going to begin at 10 o'clock. The next session in this room will be DHS Hissen's Journey to FedRAMP High on AWS GovCloud. Thank you.